Okay, we're live. Roobz, how you doing today?
I'm great, Jack. Thanks for having me on here. It's an honor.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And where are you at right now?
So I'm in Toronto. I lived here for the majority of my life. I moved to Columbus for a bit, but I'm back here. And yeah, it's like a little bit outside of Toronto, but I say Toronto because I just want to be vague about where I actually am.
I got you. Yeah, I say the same thing. Like I'm from Chicago, but I'm not actually from Chicago. I'm just like
Okay.
from like 30 minutes away. Because
Okay, yeah,
nobody
yeah.
nobody would know those small towns. But why did you move to Ohio? Was it for school?
Yeah, it was for school, but also like there was the whole pandemic situation was happening. So I was studying psychology at university, but the way things just played out, I wasn't able to continue my education at the university I was attending because they didn't have like the courses that I needed to like finish my degree.
Mhm.
So I ended up like looking at schools in the US and I got into Ohio State. So I ended up going there. But then my dad got really sick. And so I ended up coming back because I wanted to be with my family. Like he got really sick. I talked about it on Twitter too. It was like we thought he was like gonna die. Like that's how bad it was. And so I just decided I wanted to come back and be with my family.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like in those situations, like you really know what's important and what's important gets put in perspective. And I was actually going to ask you, I was reading through some of your tweets from the past couple of days.
Yeah.
And one of the ones you put out, I think it was yesterday, you said you can't really appreciate the beauty in life without pain to base it
Yeah.
on. So is that one of those formative experiences? And is that why you've appreciated life so much recently, it seems?
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote that you can't appreciate heaven if you've never seen hell. And I think you always need to like have something to compare your circumstances to. So when
Mhm.
I moved to Columbus, I had no family there. I had no friends there. I was like starting from scratch and I was alone and I had a lot of time to reflect on okay, like what is important in life? Like, is it important to be ambitious and like chase that ambition? Because when I was in Columbus, I was working round the clock. Like, I was working on my freelancing business because I'm a freelancer. I had all the time in the world. There was no family to distract me, no siblings constantly knocking on my door and asking me to like hang out with them. I was just doing my own thing and my business was doing extremely well, but there was also the aspect of it where like my mental health was suffering because I had no family relationships. I had nobody to like really talk to. I had to start over making friends, forming a community for myself. And so that was the hell aspect of it. Like when say in my tweet, you've never seen hell, you can't appreciate heaven. And so that was a part of me that was like, okay, like I feel really alone right now. And so I started to reflect on what's important. And I almost feel like my dad getting sick, that happened by design. Like that was meant to happen to get me back here, to reconnect with my family. And then once I did, I didn't want to leave anymore. Like I came here and I like I have four siblings, so there's five of us in total. And I was like, okay, like I really like being around my siblings. I really like being around my mom and dad. And I like started making this promise to myself that was like, I'm not leaving again. Like I'm not gonna leave, like no matter what. Like even if it's like, I want to get married or whatever, like the one of the deal breakers is that you have to stay like in Canada because I found the importance of community
Yeah.
through not being around a community. And so that like juxtaposition really helped me figure out what's important to me, and that's family.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you were only able to like really gain that perspective once you went through this period where you were alone for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because I went through a similar thing. First 2 years in college, like I was on the football team, so I was around
Okay.
people all the time,
Right.
and I ended up quitting the team after some injuries to really focus on myself. And like for those like 3 to 6 months, it was just a ton of like isolation and reflection,
Mm.
which part of it was really good because I started to figure out like, okay, I kind of want to like build this business online and like really
Yeah.
get my shit in order, honestly. But at the same time, you miss out on that community aspect, that family aspect. So it's like it's this trade-off. And
Mm.
I mean, it's cliche, but it's like everything happens for a reason. But I think it's more so like everything happens for a reason if you choose to see it that way. Like
Yeah, yeah.
you chose to see your dad's illness as a positive in terms of shaping what your priorities are. I chose to see my injury and quitting to set me on this new path. So perspective is everything. And I
Yeah.
wonder if psychology in some way, like studying psychology, helped us reach these conclusions.
Yeah, 100%. A little bit of background. I did neuroscience for 2 years,
Okay.
and that was more of the cognitive aspect of things, like surgical aspect. Like I wanted to be a doctor. And then 2 years into it, I was like, this really isn't for me. So I switched over to psychology. And I was always somebody that was very reflective on life and other human beings and my relationship with other people. And so psychology just felt so natural to study.
Mhm.
But I do agree with you. It does have something to do with the fact that from like a young age, have just been very interested in understanding other people, understanding my life better, understanding how community is built, right? And so I like 2 years ago when I joined Twitter, I was getting into psychology. I was reading people like Carl Jung. I was watching Jordan Peterson, and they shaped a lot of my mentality around things like family and things like sacrifice. And I credit a lot of my wisdom to that as well, just like listening and learning to these people and reading books on psychology. And so I think understanding perspective, as you said, like looking at the bright side of things always. Like you always have two options, right? When something bad happens in your life, you have two options.
Mhm.
You can let it like defeat you, you can let it break you down, you can let it completely obliterate your life, or you can choose to look at it in a positive way. So if something bad happens, like for me, it was my dad getting sick, and my dad is like my biggest role model. And so there were some days where I was very genuinely scared. I was like, okay, like how can I use this moment in my life to teach me something,
Mhm.
right? And it's not only psychology that does that for me, it's also the fact that I believe in a God. Like for me, religion and spirituality is a big part of my life. I think they're very interconnected. So spirituality and psychology is very interconnected for me. And so when you follow a religion or when you believe in a God, there's a greater purpose for everything that happens in your life. There's a greater meaning attached to the suffering that happens in your life. And so for me, when suffering comes, it's always like, okay, what is God trying to teach me here? And how is he using pain and suffering to mold who I am? Right. So what can I learn from it? How can I be a better person? How can I be better to the people around me? I think the perspective should always be geared towards becoming a better person for yourself and also becoming a better person for other people.
For sure. Yeah. And it's interesting how we reach the same conclusion, but kind of from a different angle.
Yeah.
So I grew up Lutheran and was
Okay.
confirmed Lutheran, but I'm not very religious anymore. Now, it is something that I have thought about, like maybe down the line, trying to get more back into it and like reading
Right.
different texts and stuff. Because right now, like I'd be willing to say, like, I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to
Okay.
religion.
Yeah.
Um, but something that you said that was interesting in terms of like making a choice between how you perceive a situation, I get a lot of that from reading Stoic philosophy. Like
Right.
what is in my control, what is not in my control. Like
Yeah.
take your example, your dad getting sick, like that's out of your control. But what is in your control is how you respond to the situation. And so that's kind of how I try to approach all these downfalls. Like there's something to learn in it if you choose to. And you just have to separate like, okay, I can control this, I can't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and you mentioned something else within there that I thought was interesting about how you got into Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what drew you to read these guys? Because it's actually funny. Before this podcast, I knew we were going to talk about psychology. So this morning, I spent like an hour reading 12 Rules for Life, just like
Oh,
getting
wow.
getting myself in the right headspace. But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, how'd you get into them?
Okay, so I'll touch on something you said as well right now, which is that you get your perspective or your wisdom towards, you know, changing your perspective from Stoic philosophy.
Mhm.
Well, here's the thing. It's only in the modern world that we've changed how we think. All of the people in the past, like I call it the old world. So we're looking at Stoic philosophy, we're looking at religious texts. that all has the same basis. Like it's literally traditional, timeless wisdom that people used to operate, right? And it was like a moral code almost, right? So even like Marcus Aurelius, right? Like he wrote Meditations. I think that's a wonderful book. But even for him, that was like deep, it was coming from a deeply spiritual perspective, right? Like they believed in these Roman gods, and they believed in their strength, and they believed in deriving their strength from some kind of higher power, and they lived out those philosophies in their everyday life. And so I think it's very recently that we've shifted away from using those timeless texts as the foundation of our life, right? So how did I get into Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson? It's really simple. It's honestly the fact that those two people, so Carl Jung, even though he's a psychologist, and Jordan Peterson, even though he's a psychologist, they both rely on timeless wisdom to back their psychology. Whereas if you maybe consult a clinical psychologist today, it's very science-based. It's not rooted in philosophy. But Carl Jung, he roots his psychology in philosophy. Jordan Peterson does as well. And many people don't know this, but psychology actually branches off from philosophy, right? It's not like its own science that was just created. It was just taken, okay, philosophy is the study of what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be alive? But then psychology was, okay, well, how do we examine that like in a logical sense? Like how can we observe these things happening in real life? How do we, take what philosophers have said and actually use it to help people? How do we use it to like manipulate the way people think? And so it's really just psychology is the objective understanding of what philosophers have said for a long time. So that was what drew me to Jordan Peterson. His understanding of religious texts, his understanding of philosophical texts, and then using that to help like younger people get a grip on their life and like have a better understanding of, what does it mean to be on earth. That was what drew me to him. And Carl Jung, it was a book that I just randomly picked up. It's called Man and His Symbols, and it's like his final piece of work. And it completely changed my life, completely changed my perspective. The book talks a lot about how in the modern world, we rely on logic and reason to go about life. So everything that modern human beings believe is something that they can see. So the reason why we would discredit God is because we can't see him. The reason why we would discredit things like angels and demons is because we can't see them. But he talks a lot about how a large part of the human experience is unknowable and like you can't see it. But there's still benefit in that. There's still something magical about that. And that really drew me in. And so that's how I really got into those two.
That's so cool. I haven't got into Jung much myself, but I know Jordan Peterson cites him a ton. And I've read 12 Rules. I've read the second 12 Rules. I've been consuming his content for years. So I think I just wrote it down. I'm going to check out that book, Man and His Symbols, and I'll let you know how I like it.
You should. Yeah.
Yeah, but I find it kind of fascinating how you're so into these two figures, because when I tell a lot of people within my college that I like Jordan Peterson, like they get mad. Like they see him as this horrible, like patriarchal tyrant type of guy. So like what would your response be to people who say that?
Yeah, I think recently there's been kind of a shift away from Jordan Peterson because obviously like he had a lot of trials in his life as well where I think he suffered from like a drug addiction and his life kind of fell apart. And so even people who admired him previously are now like, oh, well, why should we listen to this guy? Like, why should we follow him if he can't even follow his own ideologies? And I've thought a lot about that. And I think that the fact that he has suffered makes him more of a human being to me, and it actually gives him more credit. So what I mean by that is that I think that as a human being, if you haven't suffered, if you haven't gone through some kind of pain that has utterly shattered your life, you don't truly understand life. Like you can't understand, and this goes back to my tweet, you can't understand heaven, you can't appreciate it until you've seen hell. You can't understand the depth of the human experience until you experience pain and some kind of suffering. And so him going through that actually gives more credit to what he talks about now, because it's changed a lot of the way he responds to people. So I wrote about this as well. And previously, like, he was very emotionless, and it's when you're an intellectual, it's almost like you're removed from your emotions because you're a very logical person, right? And sometimes I feel like God, he changes us through making us go through experiences to humble us, right? And so for him, it was like, okay, well, you're gonna, you're an authority figure in people's life, and maybe you think it's easy to just tell people, hey, like, go make your bed, like, it's not hard, right? But when you go through some kind of suffering, right, when your life is falling apart, when you're depressed, it is hard to even make your bed. And so maybe he didn't have that empathetic understanding previously, and so his life fell apart, and now he can come back and actually give advice from a position where he's experienced the depths of hell, and he can say, okay, well, I've been through something bad, here's how I dealt with it, right? And so it almost gives him more credit and almost gives him more of an authority, because I don't think that you're in a position to tell other people how life should be lived if you haven't clawed your way back from some kind of a demon or some kind of suffering.
Exactly. And I think it makes him so much more human in the way that we all go through stuff. And seeing how much this guy has gone through and how he still maintains a positive perspective on the world for the most part. Now, there are times where he is extremely pessimistic, but that's more so getting into like politics and stuff. But you can see it in his emotions when he was on Piers Morgan not that long ago. And Piers asked him about like what are the struggles that young men are going through? And Jordan Peterson starts literally crying like live on interview. Like this dude, he's been through the depths of hell, like you said. That's why he has that perspective. And I know he actually was a professor at University of Toronto for a while.
Yeah, he was.
So what's the public sentiment in Canada about this guy?
Oh yeah, the public hated him. Like I remember, like, there were reports of like students barging into his classrooms and like surrounding him outside and like chanting at him and yelling at him. And you're right. Yeah, people never did, or I guess a lot of people never did take him as a positive figure, right? Because he was, again, like, he was using those timeless texts that were the foundation of how society was built, right? And because he was bringing those timeless texts back out and he was putting them front and center, and he was saying, this is how you should live your life. Hey, like, religion has told us for years and years and years that this is how you should live your life. Stoic philosophy has told us for years and years, this is how you should live your life. Why have we abandoned it? Right. And obviously the leftist ideology, like, they have their reasoning. They say we abandoned it because these people were violent and they were discriminatory and they were racist, and that's why we don't abide by this, and we don't abide by religious texts because God is made up and he's not real and you can't prove his existence, so why should we do it, right? And so whenever you're somebody, and I talked about this on the podcast with Zuby as well, we're living in a godless world, and that has consequences that extend far beyond just, oh, does somebody believe in God or not? No, it's all of the moral figures of previous generations, like how you're talking about these Stoic philosophers. They're also discredited if people don't believe in God, right? Because their moral philosophy comes from believing in multiple gods, right? Like their philosophy is coming from some kind of a spiritual source. And if we live in a world that is extremely and more increasingly science-based, they're going to discredit all of that stuff. They're going to say, hey, no, like, being Stoic doesn't help you, and you should go to therapy, and you should take pills, and that will help you get better. Like, there's no proof that you can control your own mind or you can fix yourself, but there is proof in science that you can take pills to help you control your emotions. And so, yeah, people are going to discredit all of it. They're not just going to discredit God, they're going to discredit everything, all the work that has been done. in the past like centuries, right? And create a new vision for the world, which is more science-based than it is spirituality-based.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting point you make about how like we've lost that religious touch and we've lost worshiping God. And now it seems to me as though it's increasingly more we're worshiping other idols. We're worshiping celebrities. We're worshiping our political ideologies. We're
Right.
worshiping money. We're worshiping a virus to some extent. Uh,
Yeah.
like how did we get to this point? Like, and what can we do like going forward to maybe reinstill some of these traditional values back in society?
Yeah, I think that this has been happening for a long time. So I know like people they might say, oh, like with the rise of technology, we've forgotten God. Like, no, like this has been happening for a long time. Like this has been happening. You can go back to the early like 1900s. It started with the schools. So what happened was that we took God out of the schools. We said, hey, like, you know, people have different religions. We shouldn't just be teaching based on one ideology. So they removed God from schools. And then what they replaced God with was with um, its political ideologies, but also like worshiping your country, right? So that's where that started, that thing of like, okay, well, if we remove God, what can we replace him with? Well, we replaced him with country first, right? We said, hey, like, you should worship your country. Here's a flag, here's a national anthem. And so you know, people started to have a strong love for their country, and this has always happened. But what that made way for was that, okay, well, now we've decided that we don't want people to worship country anymore. We want people to worship something else, another political ideology. And
Yeah.
so what happens when you remove God is that it makes room for a person to replace it with whatever they want.
Mhm.
Right. And so this started with also the Enlightenment. What happened was that we said, hey, how do we achieve material success instead of eternal salvation? So previously people were like, okay, like how do we achieve heaven? How do we please God? What moral code do we follow to be great men and women, right? And we stopped believing in that. We said, okay, how do we achieve earthly success? So how do we make it so that the world is fair to everybody? How do we make it so that everybody is economically well off? That's what gave rise to like communism as well, right?
Yeah.
And then we said, okay, how do we make it so that we have laws and politics in place to support these new ideologies we're creating? So essentially we created our own religion, right? We created a man-made religion that's based on politics. But what that does is that if you give one man power to create their own religious text, the goalpost will always move because it
Mhm.
gives room for other people to come in and say, well, now times have changed. I think we need to change this text a little bit. So they add new political ideologies into it,
Right.
right? And so, well, time changes again. So we add new political ideology. And so the goalpost is always moving. And it's gotten to the point where we've crossed boundaries. So now, you know, forget God. Yeah, people are studying, so it's not studying, sorry, worshiping celebrities. They're worshiping man-made viruses. They're worshiping like politics, political figures. So yeah, it's just when you remove God, which is an authority that we can't reach, right? We can't reach God. We can't change his word is set in stone. And no matter what, like this is with every religious text, like they say, like this is God's word, you can't change it, right? And the other thing is that no matter what religion you look at, they almost all have the same moral code. Like it's not like they're saying anything different. It's not like they're saying, oh, you should be violent, you should be this, you should be that. They're all saying like they have like commandments to follow and they pretty much mimic each other. But when you give a human being the potential to create their own law, it's going to change with how people feel because our nature is to change. Our nature is to progress. Our nature is to want more, right? And so it's always going to change. And that's
Mhm.
the difference between having like a religious text versus like a political text that people follow.
Right, exactly. And it seems like a constant theme throughout the Bible or throughout religion is humans start to worship idols that are not God, and that never ends up well. And so, like,
Yeah.
the story that comes to mind is Moses, like my great grandfather.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, by the way. But Moses basically sees all the people worshiping this idol calf, and he goes and gets these 10 commandments from God to remind the people who they came from.
Yeah.
But now my concern with this is, at this point, there was no science to base these claims off of, that like
Yeah.
wasn't real. Now, with how much access to science and technology we have, like, do you think we're past the point where people can come back to religion, or do you think it is possible?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say it in absolutes, but we're at a point where we're moving further and further from it.
Yes.
So, I think like even in previous generations, maybe 2 decades ago, like maybe there was a possibility. But to the point we're at now, it's like we're worshiping ourselves, right? So
Yeah.
we're worshiping our own creation. We're like, in some ways, we are surpassing God, or we're trying to surpass God. So
Right.
we're getting to a point where it's like, let's worship ourselves. Let's worship our scientists because they're such great human beings and they're capable of building so many great things. And then we're also building robots. So what's the future going to look like? Like, are we going to start worshiping AI, and are we going to start worshiping like robots? Like, who knows? But that's not to say that I don't see there's a part of the world that is moving towards progress. But that progress is also triggering some people to be like, whoa, like this is really weird. Let's go back. Let's move backwards towards some of the traditional values that we had previously. So I do see that. I see like, there's a reason why Andrew Tate grew in popularity so much, and Jordan Peterson as well, because they're saying something that has been said for a long time, but they're just reiterating it, and people are finding value in it. And like, they're like, okay, well, that's common sense. Like that makes sense to me. Whereas what we're doing now with the progressive side of it doesn't make sense, right? And so, yeah, there are a lot of people who are drawn back to maybe a religious text. And even if you leave religious texts aside, maybe spiritually they're, more curious about religious texts, or maybe they're more curious about God. Maybe they're curious about the moral code that people have followed for ages. But I don't think that there's going to be a time where people go back to God and the majority of the population goes back to God. I don't think that time is going to come. I think that what's going to happen is that people are just going to move further and further away. So if you read any religious text, especially the Abrahamic religions, as you said, they say like people start worshiping idols, and Moses came and said, hey, like there's one God, and then Jesus came and said there's one God, and then Prophet Muhammad came and said there's one God. They came because people kept moving away from religion. And the difference now is that we haven't had some kind of a prophetic figure come down and perform miracles for a long time, right? So there's no one to convince people on a mass scale that, hey, like religion exists, God exists.
Yeah.
And so if that's not going to happen, and all these religious texts, they say that's not going to happen any longer, right? Like all of them say like, we are the last ones, like that's not going to happen anymore. So then what does that say for humanity? Like, how far are we going to move away, and how bad are things going to get? Because religious texts, they outline these things like very clearly, right? Like they say like, it's going to get really bad. You're going to live in a time where the word God is going to be forgotten. It's not even going to be said anymore. Like, and in a way that's happening because, we don't like to use the word God. We use the word the universe or the one. Like nobody says plainly God, right? God made this. Everyone's like, oh, the universe has done this or whatever. So in a way, we're already at that point. So I personally don't believe that we're going to move backwards in chunks, but I do think that there are people who are starting to appreciate the old world more than the new world.
Definitely. And it seems like every time somebody tries to reintroduce these traditional values, they get canceled by like the woke left, right? Like Andrew Tate, for example, like obviously very polarizing, very controversial.
Right.
But I've consumed like hours of this guy's content just because I want to see,
Okay.
like, wait, why does everybody hate this guy? Like, I actually
Yeah.
want to come to the conclusion myself. And the
Yeah.
conclusion I came to personally is like 95% of what he says, I would say, is good for me to hear as a young man. It's
Hmm.
like, you need to be disciplined, you need to work.
Hmm.
He actually talks about worshiping God too, a
Yeah.
lot. So does Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson. And
Yeah.
these masculine figures that are trying to help young men become more masculine, they seem to get so demonized by this woke media.
Hmm.
And I even have classmates, like other young guys, like 20, 21 years old. And they asked me, like, they're like, do you like Andrew Tate? I was like, yeah, I think I agree with like a lot of what he says. There's some
Yeah.
stuff that I wouldn't support for sure. But, and then they're like, what? Like, how do you like him? Like, he's an asshole. And I'm like, wait,
Yeah.
why? Like, where are you getting this from? And then they'll pull up like top 10 worst Andrew Tate quotes, or like, how are you going to defend this? And it's like, okay, obviously, like, first of all, it's taken out of context. Second of
Yeah.
all, I don't have to ideologically agree with everything one person says. I could take things from everybody. And I think
Right.
we lost that. We have this like all or nothing thinking, like, oh, I either worship Andrew Tate or
Yeah.
I hate Andrew Tate. It's no in
Yeah.
between. And I think
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Like for me personally, there's a lot of things Andrew Tate says I obviously don't agree with because
Yeah,
I'm also a girl. And so he says a lot of things that are polarizing towards females. And
exactly.
so like I'm not gonna sit here and be like, I respect Andrew Tate. I think he's such a great guy. But I'm also not gonna sit here and say that what Andrew Tate says isn't true. There's a lot of things that he says that are true and beneficial to people, right? And so I see the value in that. I think that that's a good trait to have. A good trait to have is to be able to, take what you're going to take and leave the rest. And we have lost that. I think because we're living in a world where it's like, hey, you either follow us, like with the woke life, it's like you either follow us or you're against us. You either follow everything we say or you're against us. And so that all or nothing mentality, it comes from, not conforming to the hive mind, like not conforming to everything the political ideology is saying. But that happens with both sides. Like it happens with the right
Exactly.
and the left, right? Like so for
Become
example,
religion.
yeah, like
Become religion.
yeah, it's a way for people to be like, okay, well, this is my political ideology. If you don't believe 100% in it,
Yeah.
I don't like you. If you're in the middle ground, I don't like you. If you are seeing the gray area, I don't like you, right? Like that happened with Donald Trump as well. Like when he was elected, a lot of people hated him, a lot of people liked him.
Yeah.
And if you were in the middle ground, you essentially had no home. Like you had like the people who liked him had their clique, the people who didn't like him had their clique, and the people who were in the middle were kind of like politically homeless. Like you didn't have an ideology that you were following, but that actually alienated you even more. So I think that if you're an individual right now who is smart enough to form their own conclusions and like not go to extremes because of what the media is saying, you're actually going to feel that alienation really heavily. But it's not a bad thing. I think you should accept it. I think, yeah.
No, I agree. And I've even been in the point when I was younger where I was so like ideological on one way or the other because I just
Yeah.
didn't know because everybody around me was doing it. But then you start to ask questions and be like, why do I believe what I believe? And I think that's the first step in terms of
Yeah.
like stepping out of this like left or right and becoming like a free thinker. But I wanted to pivot.
Right.
I wanted to pivot a bit into a combination of like psychology and religion. So obviously we both study psychology. I find evolutionary psychology really interesting. And I'm wondering like what is God's role in evolutionary psychology from your perspective?
That's a good question. And I've thought it's something I've thought a lot about. So I don't discredit evolutionary psychology. I think if you're okay, let's just like if you're talking about like how humans came to be, like in the biological sense of it, a lot of people will be like religion and evolutionary biology or psychology don't mix because what science says about how humans came to be isn't what religious texts say about how humans came to be. But I think that if you read between the lines in religious texts as well, there's actually a strong case to be made that they can actually coexist, right? So God created the world in like 7 days or whatever. And I think Islam says this as well. The Bible says this as well. But, God doesn't measure time the same way that we do. So perhaps those 7 days were like thousands and thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from all of that, I think that you cannot appreciate science without religion. You cannot appreciate religion without science. So, previously, and I'll go back to my point that I was making, that people in the past, great men, they base their moral code from religious texts, right? And so even scientists like Isaac Newton, like he was talking about how I couldn't do any of this. Like I don't believe that the world was created by the Big Bang. And he says something like, the thumb alone is proof of God's existence, right? So if you look at science, and you look at the timeline that science has set, I actually think it's all by design. Like, I think that if you look at science and you see, okay, well, how were humans created? How did we come to the time that we're in and like develop into the kinds of like species that we are? And how did the world become the way it is? Well, it is by design. Like God has set a timeline for how these things will unfold. And God doesn't really, this is what I believe. I think that God operates within logic many times just so that us as human beings, we can understand him better. So he knows that we wouldn't be able to like understand very abstract concepts like, oh, the world was created in 7 days or whatever. And like, for us, that's like, whoa, like, how did you create all of this in 7 days? So for him, it's like, okay, well, how do I like logically lay this all out? How do I show humans like from the dawn of time how everything came to be? Mm-hmm. And so science is able to discover that, right? Through logic and being like, okay, well, how did this all came to be? Let's study it.
Yeah.
And it actually, the world is actually very logical, but I think you appreciate it more when you're like, well, it's all by design as well. There's like an all-knowing God that kind of created everything in a perfect manner so that everything just like fits, everything connects. It's like a puzzle piece, right? And when you step back and look at it, you can appreciate the design, but you can appreciate all the individual pieces that went into the making of the world. So I think it all connects. Like, I think that if you study science, because I studied neuroscience, so I had to study biology and the cell theory and like all of these things, which by the way, the cell theory, like it states that every cell comes from another cell, right? So then where did the first cell come from? We still don't have the answer to that, right? And so science is very theory based. I think people take science as fact, but science itself states that it's a theory. Right. That means it hasn't been proven. Like there's no origin to those things that we're discussing right now. There's no way to prove a lot of things. So it's a theory, right? It's not fact, but the general population will mistake theory for fact. And so when you're studying evolutionary psychology, when you're studying evolutionary, like biology, whatever it is that you're studying, when it comes to science, you have to understand that it's not like scientists know every single thing. Yeah. They're studying it just as, anybody else is. They're trying to understand everything. It's not like they understand. It's not like they know all the answers. Like nobody in this world knows all the answers. But God has given us free reign to explore what he's created. And so all of the things that we're now learning, all of the things that we're connecting, that's all by design. Like these are things that we're meant to know and understand about one another in the world.
Yeah, it's almost like we're discovering the secrets of the universe as we keep evolving through science. And I think my favorite thing, what you said is like, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And it kind of goes back to that like all or nothing thinking with political ideologies. It's like, you can actually take a lot from both, right? And I think that's like the main takeaway I have from that. And another thing you said that was interesting is like we expect science to just be fact when in fact it's actually theory. And I'm speaking a bit out of bounds here because I don't know that much about science and physics, but I do know that like Newton's laws and Einstein's theory of relativity that like explain how the universe works, they actually can exist together, but we take them both as fact. Right. And so that's like pure insight to me that like, okay, like science can explain a lot, but at the end of the day, it can't explain everything. Like we don't know
Right.
everything. And then that mysterious part, like that's where religion, that's where spirituality and God comes in.
Yeah, that's what I love about Man and His Symbols, because Carl Jung, he talks about that a lot. He's like, well, okay, science can't explain what happens after we die, right? Like that's one of the biggest mysteries of life. What does happen after we die? Religion can give us some understanding of it, like it can lay it out, but every religion says something different. And so a lot of things as a human being come down to pure faith. Like
Mhm.
there is no logic, there is no reason in a lot of things that we experience in the human life. Like when tragedy happens, why does it happen? Right? There's no way to scientifically be like, well, hey, like X happened and this is why this happened. No, it's literally just purely faith-based. Why do, like, people will ask me, oh, if God exists, why does an innocent kid get cancer?
Mhm.
Like, I can't tell you because I don't know. I think people struggle to say that they don't know,
Mhm.
that, maybe that we don't have all the answers. Maybe there are some things that God has just left for him and not for us to understand. And so I think faith is categorized by that, your ability to say, I don't know, but I trust God, right? I think that because we've lost that, because we've lost the faith aspect of things, where it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know who to trust. So I'm going to do whatever is in my control to figure out the answer. And so because we try so hard to figure out the answers, we end up creating a lot of like atrocities, right? Like we end up doing things and creating things that don't really help us in any way. They actually kind of destroy us. Like if we're trying to understand, I'll take this as an example. If we're trying to understand gender or sex, and we're like, okay, well, what if we could change other human beings into different genders? Like, why are we all born a specific gender? And we decided to just change things up. Like, we think that we're progressing. We think that we've done something magnificent, but it's actually harmed us in the long run, right? Same with like something like a lot of people will struggle with something like infertility, right? And so we've created all of these things that now can help women who are struggling with infertility to there's like what is the word for that, where it's like a surrogate. Like there's like a surrogate, you can like get pregnant through somebody else. But now that's like, it's like messed up, where it's like, okay, well, if you can't have a baby, you can rent another human being's body.
It's crazy. Yeah,
It's so crazy to me. Like I like
we've
just
taken on the role of God in a way. Like
yes.
we can actually, I mean, in a way it is good because we can actually create and change the external world in our favor, which
Yeah.
obviously society and civilization is a positive out of that.
Mhm.
But it's like, where do you draw the line? Where do you go too
Right.
far?
Right. That's the biggest thing that I'm exploring, where it's like we've crossed boundaries into like a realm where it's like, you know what? I don't care. I don't trust God. I don't trust that everything is working out for the better. Like if I'm struggling with something, if I'm experiencing pain, I want to solve it. I don't
Mhm.
want to just sit and be like, well, maybe there's a reason for this pain. And this goes back to the very first thing that we talked about, right? Instead of changing your perspective, people are actually trying to control the outcome, and people are actually trying to minimize pain. So that actually ties into psychology as well, where it's like, okay, whereas Stoic philosophers were like, how do you change your perspective about the things that you're dealing with? Modern psychology is like, hey, like, let's just fix it right away because you shouldn't be in pain. Let me give you this medication,
Right. Right.
right? So it's just like a matter of like modern life for me, and my understanding is categorized by an avoidance of pain rather than an acceptance of it.
I kind of want to transition more into like day-to-day practical stuff. So,
Yeah.
from a psychological perspective, like, what is your opinion on modern dating and dating apps in general?
Okay. I think dating apps are a net negative to society. Like I don't think that I don't I said something interesting a while back, and I am gonna reiterate it here. So I think it's just crazy to me that an algorithm kind of gets to decide human interaction. So when you
Right.
go on a dating app, it's almost like a computer just chose out your partner for you based
Yes.
on like certain traits that you put in. So it's like an algorithm is deciding who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. That doesn't seem normal to me. Like it's actually a very dystopian thing when you look at it, right? Like that sounds like a movie you'd watch. And like if you watch that concept on a TV show, you'd be like, that is so weird. Like a computer
Yeah.
is picking up my partner.
It's actually
Um,
funny you say that because there's a Black Mirror episode literally
yeah,
about this concept. Like they match people up and they basically like these two people fall in love and they end up like escaping this society. And then
right.
it was all a simulation and they were meant to be together in all these different simulations. And it's like, holy shit, we are not that far away from that.
Yeah, I remember watching that. I love Black Mirror. But yeah, I remember watching that. And I remember watching it like years ago and being like, oh, like, wow, like this is so weird. But now all of that stuff is actually a reality. Like it's happening. But we just think it's normal because we're conditioned to think it's normal. But if we watched our society happening on a screen, I bet you 99% of people would be so creeped out. Like they'd be like, what is that? That is weird.
Yeah, I literally sometimes take a step back and I'm like looking around it. I'm like, we are living in a dystopian future right now, but we
Yeah.
don't realize it because it's just normal to us. And I think that's another like pro and a con to studying psychology, and especially from like an evolutionary psychology lens. Like
Yeah.
I was out at a bar a couple of weeks ago with like some of my college friends, and you can see everything from this psychological point of view. It's like, why are
Yeah.
all these people here getting dressed up, like drinking to like numb their consciousness together,
Yeah.
loud music? Like, what is the underlying thing behind all this? And it's kind of
Yeah.
like, you can't, once you learn all this stuff, you can't like enjoy these moments as
Yeah.
much. Maybe I'm just psychoanalyzing everything, which I have a tendency to do. But I was
Yeah.
wondering if you feel that ever.
Oh, I do all the time. Like I actually had to so I actually had to stop psychoanalyzing everything because it was ruining my ability to enjoy things. Like I would just be sitting down and like being, okay, well, why did they just do that? But in the
Yeah.
back of my head, like it's a constant process. I think if you study psychology or you're geared towards studying psychology, you're naturally somebody who's an observant person.
Yeah.
And it's always like running in the back of your mind, you're noticing like the littlest things that are happening. So definitely I do that. And I do it like with friends, I do it with family, like in little conversations, I'm noticing what somebody said or why they said it that way. And yeah, it can be a little bit
Yeah.
like crazy at times, but I think it's a good thing. I think it's a positive overall because you're trying to understand people in general. And I love doing that. I think it's my love for people that actually put me in psychology to like better understand them.
I would say the same. Like understanding people is so fascinating, but it comes with a curse because then you start to like look at your parents, you're like, oh, like they're pretty high on this trait and like
Yeah.
they're low on this trait. Like when you learn about the big five or whatever.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
so yeah, it's all about balancing it. And some people will like be like, are you psychoanalyzing me? Like stop psychoanalyzing me. So
Yeah.
you gotta be careful there.
Yeah.
But I also I kind of wanted to get into this. So right now you're a freelancer entrepreneur. You graduated from university last year, is that correct?
So I have one semester left. I like when I came
Oh
back when my
wow.
dad got sick, I took a pause and I was like, I will just like spend time with my family, work on my business, and then go back. So I'll be going back in September of this year and just finishing my semester off, and then I'll be done with it.
Back to Ohio State.
No, I'll be staying here. I'll enroll in like my old university here because it's
Okay.
in my town. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I gotcha. Okay, very cool. And like post graduation, like what are you thinking right now in terms of the future?
So if you had asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have told you that I wanted to open up my own like practice and
Yeah.
do like family therapy or something like that, or work in child development. And there's a part of me that still wants to do that. I do enjoy working with children a lot in the sense that I think children are the building blocks of a society. And I
Mhm.
think that in current society, we're not doing our due diligence in that aspect. Like we put like kids in daycare and we just let strangers deal with them, and we don't really put a lot of effort into like making them into good human beings and like cultivating their natural curiosity and wonder and helping them grow into competent adults. I think we've really just like thrown that to the side. I think people very much care about their adult lives and their careers and how they can progress in society, that they don't worry about children. And we are even having less children than ever before, right? So in the Western world, at least, right? I'll talk about the Western world specifically. So my goal was always to like either become a teacher or work in child development of some sort, like maybe social work of some sort.
Yeah.
But now it's a little bit different because, as you already said, I started freelancing and I saw a lot of value in using the internet to create your own business. And so post-graduation, I almost feel like I just want to like stick to coaching because that's what I do now. And you know, I have the credits, like I have the degree, but it's not necessarily that I'll be using that to build up my business. It's almost like, okay, what are the skills that I have? Well, these are the skills that I have. It's, you know, my ability to help people with their problems, whatever they're facing. And so how can I leverage that online? And I think there's so much value in that because, for example, if you set up a practice, like a private practice, you're confined to one location, right?
Mhm.
But if you're online, you're helping people from all over the world.
Right.
There's so much more scope and possibility there that just isn't available to you if you go the traditional route of like getting your degree and like settling down in one location and working there for the rest of your life. I think the internet has given us more possibility than ever.
Yeah.
So for me, now it's definitely, at least for like maybe the next 10 years, it's definitely still going to be work through the internet. Maybe build on my, you know, the bookstore that I'm working on right now, 2-story books. That's opening up in Georgia, Savannah. And so that's geared towards like community as well. And that's something I'm very passionate about. It's about opening up a third space. So back to our like dating apps conversation, I don't believe that people should meet through dating apps. I think they should meet in real life through like places that that encourage them to talk to one another. That's what the bookstore is all about. It's about having a place to come and sit down and spark conversation. And that's very psychological in a way as well, because it's about, well, how do we build strong communities, right? How do we shift away from the world of technology back to real life? And how does that impact people? So that's something I'm passionate about. And then I also want to continue coaching because that's what I do on the side.
Yeah.
And then maybe like in old age, like maybe when I'm like 40, 50, I
Yeah.
can like publish some papers or publish some work through my actual accreditation rather than, you know, just like sit and start a practice or whatever.
That's so cool. And as you were talking, I was like, yeah, you could be a great clinical therapist or a great child care services person,
Mhm.
but your impact with the internet can be so much more widespread. And
Right.
like to be doing this at your age already and having these thoughts, like I can only imagine in like 20, 30 years, like the impact you could potentially have on the world. Like,
Thank you.
like, could you see a book in your future potentially?
Yeah, I do. So I actually, somebody reached out to me and like offered to publish a book that I wrote through their company. But because I'm so young, I actually like decided against it because
Yeah.
like, well, I'm only like 23. Like I don't want to write something and then in the future be like, whoa, I don't agree with what I said when I was 23. So
Mm.
I want to let myself develop a little bit more in my beliefs and get a little bit better at like forming the thoughts that I have. That's why I'm doing a lot more podcasts now too, because I actually want to get into the habit of communicating my ideas with people in more ways than just Twitter.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that it's also necessary when you're young and working on something that could be super powerful to be humble about it because you have a lot to learn. You are you know, standing on the shoulders of giants. Like there have been people before you that have done great things. Um, and for me, it's like I'm just getting started. Like this is just the beginning, and I want to learn as much as I can before I put something out there that, you know, that is going to impact a lot of people that I know that I firmly believe in.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise way to look at it because like I mean, you studied neuroscience, you know, like our
Yeah.
brains aren't even developed till we're 25. And
Right,
so
right.
imagine the perspectives and the knowledge you'll have when you're like 30, 35 compared to now. You'll probably
Yeah,
look back and be like, wow, I didn't know anything. Whereas
yeah,
now, like as very young kids ourselves, like it seems like we know a lot, but
yeah, yeah.
in
It's so
hindsight,
funny.
yeah.
Yeah, because when I was 19, I had that mentality. It was like, I know everything. I
Oh,
know everything.
same.
And I used to
Same.
come from like this, I used to come from this like position of like so much authority. And like the older I get, the more I'm like, wow, like I know nothing. I know
Yeah.
nothing. And I think every year that happens where it's like you're every year you grow up and you're like, wow, I knew nothing last year. Like I just learned so much. And I think there's like value and understanding that there's a lot for you to learn at any age, right? Like even when I'm 30, 40, I'm sure I'll be learning, whether it's
Yeah.
from people that are older than me or people that are younger than me. I'm sure I'll be learning. Yeah.
Yeah, and that ties into like the one final point I wanted to hit on. You tweeted today, you said you believe people age more based on experiences than through years.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to get into that. Like I've personally had, I'd say in the last 9 months, it feels like I've had like 5 years of growth. So
Right.
like how can people foster that growth and like rapidly accelerate their maturity if they want to?
I think I'm gonna give a shout out to there's a guy on Twitter. His name is Zach Hommel. He says something. He says do hard things. I think that's how you can accelerate your growth. Like I firmly believe that it's just doing things that are out of your comfort zone,
Mhm.
putting yourself out there, chasing new opportunities, doing something that is different from what you've always done. I do like this is weird about me, but I purposely make my life harder than it needs to be. Even if it's something as small as like maybe driving to another city, like, okay, what's like the longest route that I can take to get there? What are some ways that I can make this interesting for myself, right?
Yeah.
Because whenever you do something that is spontaneous, whenever you do something that's a little bit out of your comfort zone, you're going to learn something new about yourself. You're going to learn something new about the world. Who knows? Maybe you'll have an encounter with somebody that'll just be like crazy and it'll blow your mind. But my life, like I credit my wisdom to the fact that I have never turned down an opportunity to do something that is completely out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And every time I've done that, I've met people that have spoken to me about their lives and their journeys, and I've always learned something. I've always learned something from somebody else that I've met on this weird journey that I've took. And so if you want to accelerate your growth as a person, don't just wait until I'm going to wait to do this when I'm 30. I'm going to wait to do this. Do it now. Start now. Start taking the steps to where you want to go. Start making your life as uncomfortable as possible. Don't be scared of that, because the more you step out of your comfort zone, the more you're going to learn. And the more you learn, or the more experiences you have, the more your soul is actually going to be able to be like, okay, well, I actually learned something. I'm actually getting wiser, and I'm actually aging. I'm not 20 years old. I've learned as much as maybe like a 30-year-old. Like you don't want to see your life as a number. You want to see your life as one big experience.
Yeah, I love that. And wisdom, like true wisdom, comes through experience, not necessarily years.
Yeah.
And, we live in such a frictionless society. Like, if you really wanted to, you could just chill on the couch all day, get instant gratification from your
Right.
phone, eat junk food all day. And
Yeah.
in the old world, that wasn't possible. So it's so important to like force that friction into your life daily. Like, force yourself to do something uncomfortable. I don't think that makes you weird. I think that actually makes you extremely sane,
Yeah.
because it's what keeps you sane. Because if you just indulge in these immediate gratifications all the time, like your motivation, everything is it's gonna completely drop off the roof. But
Yeah, I agree.
and back to what you said about like you don't have to wait till you're 30 to start something. Like that's exactly how I feel with this podcast. Like
Yeah.
starting this podcast at first, like I had no idea what I'm doing. Like
Yeah.
it was extremely uncomfortable, but through this, I get to talk to people like that I would never have connected with before. Like
Yeah.
I would never have this type of conversation on a daily basis. But since I just like push through the discomfort, I'm like, you know what? I don't care if people think I'm weird. I'm just gonna start the podcast. Now it's like wow, I'm being able to talk to really fascinating people. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, for
I think
sure.
it's a great point.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of doing something. Like, here's the thing, like, with most of the people that I coach, they're always like, well, I'm scared. Like, I'm scared of what other people are going to think. I'm
Mhm.
scared that my work is not going to be as good as I thought. And I'm like, well, you don't gain confidence by just like not doing anything. You gain confidence by starting and then getting feedback from other people, right? So for you, you started this podcast, and I think you're doing a great job, right? Like you put yourself out there, and you're right. Like these networking opportunities, they don't just drop in your lap. You have to create them, right? So for anybody that's just like stuck, it's like, take the first step. Like, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. You just need to do the thing. You need to do the thing and figure it out as you go, rather than like try and plan everything out and just wait and wait and wait and have like analysis paralysis over what you're going to do.
Exactly. And it's like more so than thinking you're going to get it right on the first try, you're going to get it wrong. But
Yeah.
once you figure out like all the ways that you can do something wrong, then you find the right thing. Like
Yeah.
I saw this thing. I actually tweeted this today.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton failed at the light bulb
Yeah.
6,000 times, and everybody thought he was like absolutely insane. I said Isaac Newton, Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah, I was
we
about to say.
we were talking about Isaac Newton earlier, but yeah, Thomas Edison, 6,000 tries, got it
Yeah.
wrong. Everybody thought he was insane because he just kept trying.
Yeah.
Finally, on like the 6,000th try, he gets it right, and everybody calls him a genius. But nobody
Right.
saw the 5,999 before that. So it's
Yeah.
like he would have never got to that point had he not just started. And so that's
Yeah.
why it's so important to just do something.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add like one thing. I remember I was learning how to do like a headstand, and I remember I started and I was like, I sucked. Like, I would fall over.
Yeah.
I was scared too, because like I didn't want to fall. Like, that would
Yeah.
suck. But I was falling every single time, and I was like hurting myself. But then one day I did it, and for some reason my body just knew what to do. Like, it knew that it just needed to stand up straight. And so I learned a very important lesson from just doing this tiny thing. And that was that you cannot succeed if you don't fail. Like, you need to fail and fail and fail and fail until you get it right.
Yeah.
And one day, like, failure is almost a way for your brain to like condition itself again and again. So every time you fail, your brain learns something new. Right. So every time that I was doing the headstand, but I was failing, my body was learning something new about how to like stand straight while I'm upside down. Right. And so it was conditioning itself. And then one day my body just knew, like, okay, this is how you do it. And so if you don't fail, like if you're afraid of failure, you're not going to succeed, because you're not going to condition your brain. You're not going to set yourself up to understand what perfection looks like.
Right. But how somebody might counter that and say, like, I'm too scared to even try. Like, how can somebody just break through that belief or break through that fear and just take a first step? Because often the first step is the hardest one to take.
Yeah. I think there's no magic solution to that. That there is literally just you and your ability to conquer your thoughts. And I always say that the human life is literally a battle between you and your mind. Okay. So that you are actually a different thing. Like, that's why I say the soul is a different part of the body than the mind. And so your soul is that conscious thing inside of you, and then your mind is like the thing that produces all of your thoughts, right? So you need to battle your mind. You need to wake up every day and go to war with your own mind and be like, okay, well, my mind is going to tell me not to do something, I'm still going to do it.
Yeah, that's a great quote. Like, you should tweet this. The human experience is a battle with your own mind. That's like, that's really leaving on a good foot right there. I think that's a great place to end it. That's a really wise thing to say, but I really appreciate you coming on. I think your message is so powerful, especially in a world that's like so polarized and everything online. Like, you're spreading these positive messages to people, and you're teaching a lot of people along the way. I learned a ton from this conversation, so I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack, for having me on. I think what you're doing is great with your podcast, and yeah, I think you should keep doing it. And I'm excited to see your growth on Twitter as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely have to reconnect maybe like a year or two down the line, see where we are. Should be
For
interesting.
sure.
Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate you.
Not a problem.